5:12 in the morning. The city is still asleep. Horses stamp their hooves in the stables. A baker lights the oven before dawn. A sailor walks along the pier, alone, listening only to the waves. Then, for 20 seconds, nothing happens. A small tremor passes, almost unnoticed, as if the earth were only clearing its throat. The people who wake up think it is already over. They are wrong. 20 seconds later, the ground of San Francisco stops being solid. An entire street moves like a sheet shaken from underneath. Streetcar tracks twist like wire. Four-story brick facades collapse onto the sidewalk in under 10 seconds. In a house on Valencia Street, the second floor simply drops onto the first, like a drawer sliding shut. Across the bay, a professor of geology is thrown from his bed. He walks to the window. What he sees makes no sense. Street lamps swaying in waves, as if they were stalks of wheat in the wind. For almost a full minute, 45 to 60 seconds according to the records that would survive that morning, the entire California coast shakes. From Oregon down to south of Los Angeles. From San Francisco inland to Nevada. Then silence. A strange silence, thick with dust, cut by the sound of glass breaking somewhere in the distance. People step outside in their nightclothes. They look up. They look at the buildings. They look at each other, trying to find in any of those faces some kind of explanation. At that moment, no one knows one essential thing. The worst has not happened yet. The shaking lasted less than a minute. What comes next will last 3 days, and it will erase from the map an area larger than what the city of Chicago at the time could have imagined losing in a single morning. How did a tremor lasting less than a minute manage to destroy 80% of one of the most important cities in the United States? Why couldn't the firefighters, trained and prepared, put out the fire that followed? And why, decades later, would this exact event, not the largest war, not the biggest explosion, but an earthquake on an April morning, rewrite forever the way science understands earthquakes themselves? This is not only the story of a destroyed city. It is the story of a mistaken idea that humanity had carried for centuries. The idea that the ground beneath our feet was, by definition, the one truly stable place on the planet. San Francisco, in 1906, was about to break that idea. And in breaking it, the disaster would hand science the first piece of a puzzle that still explains today why continents move, why oceans open, and why at this very moment, somewhere on the planet, a geological fault is quietly building up the energy for the next great rupture. Before telling how the city fell, it is worth explaining why absolutely no one saw that danger coming. But first, a quick word. If you're watching this documentary from somewhere in the world, leave a comment telling us which city or country you're watching from. It's always remarkable to see how many different places connect around the same story. If you're not part of the community yet, consider subscribing. Many more stories like this one are coming, stories where a single event reveals how the whole world was quietly rebuilt behind the headlines. Now, back to 1906. Rewind 4 years. San Francisco is not just a prosperous city. It is living proof that the American West had worked out. Half a century earlier, that stretch of land by the Pacific was little more than a Spanish fishing village called Yerba Buena. Then came the gold. In 1848, nuggets found in the nearby mountains turned the bay into a magnet. Entire ships arrived packed with men willing to risk everything. Within a few years, the population leapt from a few hundred to tens of thousands. By 1906, San Francisco no longer resembles that mining camp in any way. Nearly 400,000 people live there. It is the largest city on the American West Coast, the main Pacific port of the United States, the financial center linking the East Coast to Asia. Electric streetcars climb hilly streets. Buildings of stone and brick, many 6, 7, even 12 stories tall, rise proudly in the financial district as symbols of modernity. The Palace Hotel, with its 800 rooms, is considered one of the most luxurious in the country, its central atrium covered in glass, where carriages once drove straight in to drop off their guests. Immigrants from every corner of the world settle into their own neighborhoods. Irish, Italian, Chinese, German, Mexican. Chinatown, the largest Chinese neighborhood outside Asia, pulses with markets, theaters, and temples. The city has an opera house. It has daily newspapers. It has banks financing half of the mining and agriculture of the American West. Caruso, the most famous tenor in the world, is staying at the Palace Hotel that very night of April 17th, having just finished singing Carmen at the Grand Opera House before a standing audience. No one in that audience applauding Caruso knows they are witnessing the last ordinary night the city will experience for many years. And that ordinary calm is exactly what needs to be understood before anything else. Because the more alive, the more prosperous, the more carefree that city seemed, the greater the loss about to come. Beneath all that splendor, invisible, lay a problem that the science of the time simply did not know how to name. By the end of the 19th century, geologists already knew about a long crack in the landscape running parallel to the California coast, what we now call the San Andreas Fault. Farmers noticed fences that, over the years, appeared strangely shifted, as if someone had cut the wire and moved it a few feet to the side. Streams that once ran in a straight line seemed to bend slowly, year after year, for no apparent reason. No one understood why. The geology of that era still had no concept of tectonic plates. That theory would not take hold for decades. Scientists in 1906 believed earthquakes were caused by the fault itself, as if the crack in the earth were the source of the problem rather than merely the scar of a much deeper process. It was like blaming a crack in a wall for the tremor that caused it. That was the first false sense of security of the time, believing the enemy was understood when in truth it could barely be seen at all. The second illusion was even more dangerous, because it belonged not to the scientists but to the city itself. San Francisco had felt tremors before. Small, moderate, uncomfortable, but never catastrophic within living memory. The city had been built too fast, too rich, too proud to worry deeply about what lay beneath it. Buildings were raised on landfill, soil dumped in earlier decades to extend the coastline and gain more urban space. Mixed with rubble, trash, and loose sediment, this fill looked solid enough to any resident's eye. No one knew that, under intense pressure, that kind of soil behaves almost like a liquid. There was also a third factor, slow and silent, that had been building for decades without anyone able to see or feel it. Over nearly 50 years, land surveys along the California coast, taken from maps and property boundaries, not for science, had been recording something strange. Fixed points on one side of the fault were slowly drifting apart from points on the other side. Not suddenly. Inch by inch, year after year, one edge of the fault crept quietly northward while the other barely moved at all. That slow deformation had a name that science had not yet invented. The rock along the fault was being stretched like a giant rubber band pulled from both ends. And a rubber band, as anyone knows, eventually snaps. At 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, after nearly 5 decades of silent tension building beneath the Northern California coast, the rubber band finally snapped. Along almost 480 kilometers of fault, in a single instant, the compressed rock let go. At some points, one side of the ground slid more than 6 meters relative to the other, nearly instantly. The energy released in that moment equaled thousands of bombs detonating at once along a line running beneath entire cities. A small foreshock strikes first, brief and seemingly harmless. 20 to 25 seconds later, the main shock arrives. In San Francisco, it lasts between 45 seconds and a full minute, long enough for brick buildings, raised without any real reinforcement against horizontal shaking, to simply come apart. The buildings on landfill, those raised on the soft ground that had expanded the city toward the bay, suffer the worst. The soil behaves almost like wet sand shaken in a bucket. It loses all firmness, and everything on top of it sinks, cracks, and collapses. Buildings raised on solid bedrock, in the higher neighborhoods, shake violently, but in many cases stay standing. It is the first great lesson of that morning, understood by no one at the time. The same earthquake can destroy one street and leave the street next to it almost untouched, depending only on what lies, invisible, beneath the pavement. Only decades later would that observation become one of the pillars of modern seismic engineering. That morning, Though, no one is thinking about engineering. They're thinking about survival. Chimneys crash through rooftops as families still sleep. Gas pipes, ruptured by the shaking, begin leaking quietly at dozens of points across the city. In the poorer neighborhoods, poorly built wooden buildings simply fold in on themselves. And beneath the entire city, something even more decisive breaks: the network of pipes feeding the fire hydrants. That detail, small, technical, almost bureaucratic, will become the true origin of the tragedy about to begin. Because the earthquake alone would already have been remembered as one of the worst natural disasters in American history. But the earthquake is not what decided San Francisco's fate. What decided the city's fate began minutes later, when someone, somewhere among the ruins, unknowingly lit a flame near a gas leak. The fire that water couldn't stop. Fires break out almost simultaneously at dozens of different points in the city. Stoves knocked over, snapped electrical wires, gas leaks meeting still glowing embers from the morning's kitchen fires. Any one of these fires, on its own, would have been an ordinary emergency, exactly the kind of thing the San Francisco Fire Department, one of the most respected in the country, knew perfectly well how to handle. But the fire chief, Dennis Sullivan, is among the first casualties of the morning. A chimney collapses onto the roof of the firehouse where he sleeps, and he dies days later from his injuries. In the first minute of crisis, the city loses the one man who might have had the experience and authority to coordinate a large-scale emergency response. Then comes the second blow, even more decisive than the first. The surviving firefighters run to the hydrants. They turn the valves. Nothing comes out. The earthquake ruptured the main pipes carrying water into the heart of the city. Without pressure, without flow, hydrants run nearly dry in entire neighborhoods, exactly where the fire's spreading fastest. The fires that started apart, one on each block, begin to meet, merge, and form ever larger walls of flame, fed by wooden buildings, shops full of merchandise, and narrow streets that act like wind tunnels. Facing desperation, military authorities make a decision that seems logical at the moment. Use dynamite to bring down entire blocks, creating open fire breaks to stop the fire's advance, the same technique used for decades to contain wildfires. The decision backfires terribly. Lacking enough experience in controlled demolition inside a dense urban area, the explosions often scatter embers, and burning would be beyond the fire breaks, setting alight blocks that had still been untouched. For 3 days and 3 nights, the fire consumes San Francisco block by block. Residents pile their most treasured belongings onto carts, baby carriages, anything with wheels, and walk slowly away from downtown, glancing back to watch their own homes vanish behind a wall of orange smoke. At the Palace Hotel, the very hotel where Caruso had slept the night before, guests flee still in their robes, carrying jewelry wrapped in pillowcases. The building, the city's pride, burns until only its blackened outer walls remain standing. City Hall, a symbol of the city's power, partially collapses during the shaking itself and is then consumed by fire, leaving only a twisted steel skeleton exposed to the sky. Official records, property deeds, decades of the city's administrative history turn to ash inside the very vaults meant to protect them. When the flames finally die out, on the 4th day, more than 28,000 buildings no longer exist. About 80% of the city's built area has been destroyed, not by the shaking itself, but mainly by the fire it unleashed. Of the nearly 400,000 people who had gone to sleep in San Francisco that morning of April 18th, more than 220,000 are left homeless overnight. The official death toll announced by authorities at the time was around 700 people. Modern historical research, however, reviewing hospital records, cemeteries, and accounts of entire neighborhoods that simply disappeared, now suggests the real number exceeded 3,000 lives, for times what the city was willing to admit at the time. Here is something few documentaries mention. In the days following the disaster, city authorities and the real estate industry made a conscious decision: publicly minimize the earthquake's role in the destruction, attributing nearly everything to the fire. The reason was not vanity. It was money. At the time, Most insurance policies covered fire damage, but explicitly excluded earthquake damage, considered too high a risk for insurers to accept. If it were officially recorded that the earthquake was the main cause of the destruction, thousands of property and business owners simply would not receive any payout, and the city's rebuilding might never happen. So the public story shifted. Newspapers, official reports, and even postcards from that period began referring to the disaster almost exclusively as the Great San Francisco Fire, reducing the earthquake to a footnote. That choice carried a quiet but real cost. By avoiding full acknowledgement of the earthquake's force, the city also delayed for decades serious debates about earthquake-resistant construction, postponing reforms that might have saved lives in future tremors. It took the persistence of a group of scientists to bring the full truth about that April 18th into the history books. While the city still smoldered, a geologist named Andrew Lawson from the University of California was already walking through the ruins with a notebook in hand. Lawson had a mission that seemed, at first glance, almost cold in the face of tragedy, to scientifically document every inch of ground displacement, every crack in the earth, every twisted fence, every bent rail. He gathered around him a commission of scientists tasked with producing the most complete report ever made on an earthquake up to that point, what would become known as the Lawson Report, published in 1908. For the first time, the San Andreas Fault was mapped in detail across hundreds of kilometers, revealing its true extent as a continental-scale geological feature, not merely a local curiosity. But the decisive moment of that investigation did not come from Lawson. It came from a geology professor at Johns Hopkins University named Harry Fielding Reid, who focused on something that seemed minor within the report: land survey measurements taken along the California coast since 1850, decades before the earthquake. Reid noticed something no one had seen so clearly before. In the 50 years before 1906, fixed points on one side of the fault had gradually shifted more than 3 meters relative to points on the other side, a movement far too slow to be felt, yet recorded year after year by survey instruments. And after the earthquake, when he compared the new measurements with the old ones, he found something even more revealing. The sudden displacement caused by the tremor almost exactly matched the tension that had accumulated slowly over those 5 decades. Reid's conclusion, published in 1910, would forever change how humanity understands earthquakes. He proposed that rock around a fault behaves like an elastic material. It slowly deforms under the pressure of the Earth's own forces, building up strain year after year, until the rock's resistance is finally overcome. At that moment, the rock breaks along the fault and rebounds like a stretched rubber band suddenly released, releasing all at once the energy stored up over decades. This idea became known as the theory of elastic rebound. Before Reid, scientists mistakenly believed the fault itself caused the earthquake, as though the crack in the ground generated the problem. Reid completely reversed that logic. The fault does not cause the earthquake. It simply marks where the Earth's accumulated tension finally breaks free. It is the difference between blaming a crack in a wall for a tremor and understanding that the crack is only the point where pressure, built up slowly over years, finally found an outlet. This theory, formed from the ruins of San Francisco, remains today the fundamental model used by seismologists anywhere on the planet to explain why earthquakes happen. There is, however, something remarkable that almost no documentary mentions. Neither Reid nor Lawson nor any scientist in 1906 knew the true reason why that tension had been building for decades along the California coast. The theory of plate tectonics, the idea that the Earth's surface is made up of enormous rigid plates that slowly move, collide, pull apart, or slide past one another, would not be widely accepted by the scientific community until decades later, only from the 1960s onward. Had scientists in 1906 already known that theory, they would have immediately understood that the San Andreas Fault marks precisely the boundary where the Pacific Plate slowly slides against the North American Plate at a rate of only a few centimeters a year, roughly the speed at which a human fingernail grows. Reid had correctly described the mechanism, the buildup and sudden release of tension, without yet knowing which planet-scale force lay behind it. Even so, his theory of elastic rebound would fit perfectly decades later into the larger framework of plate tectonics, becoming one of the few scientific ideas from the pre-modern era to survive an entire scientific revolution intact. Rarely in history has a single disaster produced, at the same time, a correct theory about how a phenomenon works, and, decades later, fit perfectly into an even larger theory about how the planet itself functions. While scientists were still processing the data, the city of San Francisco faced a far more urgent question. How do you rebuild an entire city when 220,000 people are sleeping in makeshift camps inside public parks? In the months after the disaster, army tents spread across Golden Gate Park and other green spaces around the city, sheltering entire families who had lost everything. Community kitchens hand out meals. Small temporary wooden houses, later known as earthquake shacks, are hastily built in organized rows, many of which would still be standing, remodeled decades later, as quiet reminders of a temporary arrangement that became permanent. International aid arrives quickly. Donations totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars come from London. Standard Oil, magnate Andrew Carnegie, and the Canadian government each contribute $100,000, considerable sums by the standards of the time. Reconstruction moves at a remarkable pace. Within a few years, much of downtown had already been rebuilt, though not always following the lessons the disaster itself should have taught. Many buildings were rebuilt too quickly, under economic pressure, without consistently incorporating techniques capable of withstanding a similar tremor. The true revolution in California's earthquake-resistant engineering would still take decades to mature fully, advancing more decisively only after other earthquakes throughout the 20th century. Still, 1906 planted the seed. Engineers began studying, for the first time on a real scale, why some buildings had survived while others, across the very same street, had collapsed. These observations slowly evolved into building code, structural requirements, and, decades later, into an entire discipline of seismic engineering that today protects millions of people in earthquake-prone regions around the world. What actually changed after San Francisco? Science changed. Reed's theory of elastic rebound remains, to this day, the fundamental model explaining why earthquakes occur along faults like the San Andreas. The way the planet monitors tremors changed. The 1906 earthquake was one of the first major seismic events recorded by seismographs in several parts of the world at once, helping drive the creation of international seismic monitoring networks that still exist today, expanded and modernized. Engineering changed. Observations about why certain buildings survived and others did not, often tied directly to the type of soil beneath their foundations, laid the groundwork for construction practices that decades later became mandatory in building codes across earthquake-prone regions of the world. And, slowly, the way societies confront the uncomfortable truth about natural disasters also changed. The episode of the city publicly downplaying the earthquake's role to protect insurance and real estate interests would become, decades later, a case study cited by historians and sociologists on how economic interest can distort the historical record of a tragedy. The San Andreas Fault, however, remains exactly where it has always been. It did not disappear after 1906. It simply released in that instant the tension built up over 5 decades and immediately began accumulating tension again, inch by inch, year after year, just as it had before. Seismologists today know that entire segments of that same fault, including stretches near densely populated areas of modern California, have already built up enough strain to produce, at some point in the future, an earthquake of comparable magnitude to 1906, a scenario the California scientific community refers to, without dramatization, simply as the next big one. No one knows exactly when it will happen, and it is precisely that uncertainty, not the exact date, but the statistical certainty that sooner or later the tension will break again, that turns 1906 from simple historical memory into a warning that remains fully current. The shaking lasted less than a minute. The fire it unleashed lasted 3 days. But the change it sparked in how science understands the planet itself is still unfolding more than a century later. Harry Fielding Reid looked at measurements taken by ordinary surveyors decades before any earthquake and saw something no one else had noticed, that the Earth, silently, stores the energy of every future tremor long before any shaking ever occurs. Perhaps that is the true lesson buried beneath the ruins of San Francisco. Great ruptures rarely begin at the instant they explode. They begin much earlier, slowly, silently, invisible to those living directly above them, until the day the accumulated tension finally finds its way out. The question that remains, more than 100 years later, is not only geological. It is about any tension that builds too slowly to be felt, until the moment it can no longer be ignored.